Every time I asked to go into the basement, my aunt would snap. You don't need anything down there. After her death, I found the key, and what I saw made me shake. I was 5 when my parents died in that car accident on Highway 35. The rain had been coming down hard that October night, and their sedan hydroplaned into oncoming traffic. I remember sitting in the hospital waiting room, my small legs dangling from the plastic chair, not really understanding why everyone kept looking at me with those sad eyes. My aunt showed up around midnight, her face stern but not unkind. She knelt down to my level and told me I'd be coming home with her. That was it. No hugs, no tears, just the cold reality that my life had changed forever. Her house was old, built sometime in the 1940s, with creaky wooden floors and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. It sat on a quiet street where all the neighbors kept to themselves, surrounded by overgrown hedges that blocked most of the sunlight from reaching the front porch. The basement door was right off the kitchen, painted the same dull green as the rest of the trim, but it always stayed locked. Heavy deadbolt, the kind you'd see on a front door. Those first few months were rough. I'd wake up crying most nights, calling for my mom, and my aunt would appear in the doorway with her arms crossed. She never comforted me, never sat on the bed or rubbed my back like my mom used to. Instead, she'd stand there until I stopped crying, then leave without a word. During the day, she'd watch me constantly. Not in a caring way, but like she was studying something under a microscope. I couldn't put my finger on it then, but looking back, it felt clinical. The basement became this forbidden mystery that occupied way too much of my young mind. Whenever I get close to that door, she'd appear out of nowhere with some chore for me to do or a snack to distract me. When I finally worked up the courage to ask what was down there, she'd get this look in her eyes that made my stomach twist. Her voice would drop low, and she'd lean in close, telling me there were rats down there, big ones, and the stairs were rotted through. Too dangerous for a little boy. But I was curious the way all kids are curious about forbidden places. Sometimes I'd press my ear to the door when she was outside tending to her garden. I never heard any rats. No scurrying, no squeaking, just silence. Once, I caught a glimpse of her coming up from down there late at night. She was carrying what looked like a small box, moving carefully like she didn't want to wake me. The next morning when I asked about it, she acted like I'd imagined the whole thing. School was its own nightmare. My aunt had enrolled me in the elementary school about 10 minutes from the house, and I struggled to make friends. The other kids seemed to sense something was off about me, though I couldn't blame them. I developed this stutter that came out of nowhere, usually when I was nervous or excited. My aunt would get this tight expression whenever it happened, like I was doing it on purpose to annoy her. She never took me to see anyone about it, just told me to slow down and think before I spoke. The stutter got worse as months turned into years. Teachers would call home when I'd have particularly bad days, barely able to get through reading aloud or answering questions in class. My aunt would listen to their concerns with that same clinical detachment, promising to work with me at home. But she never did. Instead, she'd watch me even more intently during those episodes, sometimes pulling out a small notebook and jotting things down when she thought I wasn't looking. By the time I turned 8, the crying had mostly stopped, but other weird behaviors had taken its place. I'd started having these episodes where I'd just zone out completely, staring at nothing for minutes at a time. My aunt called them my blank spells. The first time it happened at dinner, I came back to reality to find her standing over me with that notebook again, writing furiously. When I asked what she was doing, she snapped it shut and told me to finish my vegetables. The isolation was probably the worst part. My aunt rarely let me have friends over, and when she did, she'd hover nearby, listening to our conversations and intervening whenever things got too loud or fun. Sleepovers were absolutely out of the question. She'd make up excuses about not having enough space or me being too young, but I could see the other parents thought it was strange. Eventually, the invitations stopped coming. I spent most of my time alone in my room, a small space at the back of the house with one window that looked out onto the neighbor's fence. My aunt had decorated it with generic boy stuff, sports posters, a blue bedspread, model cars on the dresser. None of it felt like mine. The walls were thin enough that I could hear her moving around the house at all hours, sometimes walking back and forth in the hallway outside my door like she was pacing. The bathroom was right across from my bedroom, and I always felt like I was being watched when I was in there. Call it paranoia or intuition, but something about that feeling never left me. I'd rush through baths and brush my teeth as quickly as possible, constantly glancing at the small window near the ceiling and the corners where the walls met. My aunt would always ask how my bath was afterward, wanting specific details about what I'd done and how long I'd been in there. When I turned 10, the questions started getting weirder. She'd want to know about my dreams, what I thought about before falling asleep, whether I ever felt scared at night. I learned to give short answers because lengthy responses would just lead to more questions and more notes in that ever-present notebook. She kept multiple notebooks, actually, different colored covers, all filled with her cramped handwriting. The breaking point came when I was 11 and going through what my aunt called a difficult phase. I'd started pushing back against her rules, questioning why I couldn't do things other kids did, demanding to know why the basement was off limits. Each rebellion was met with more restrictions and longer periods of what she called quiet time in my room. During one particularly heated argument about why I couldn't join the school soccer team, I threatened to break down the basement door myself. Her reaction was unlike anything I'd seen before. She grabbed me by the shoulders, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks, and told me that if I ever went near that door without permission, she'd send me away to live with strangers who wouldn't care about me at all. The threat worked. I was terrified of being abandoned again, of losing the only stability I had left, twisted as it was. That last year living with her was the longest year of my life. I'd gotten quieter, more withdrawn, spending hours just staring out my bedroom window. The stutter had mostly disappeared, but it was replaced by this constant feeling of being observed. Even when my aunt wasn't in the room, I felt like someone was watching me. I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder or checking corners for no reason. When I turned 12, my aunt announced that I'd be going to live with a distant cousin across the state. She said I needed to be around other family, that she'd done her part raising me, but it was time for someone else to take over. I was heartbroken and relieved at the same time. Heartbroken because despite everything, she was the only family I had left. Relieved because maybe, finally, I could be a normal kid. The transition was jarring but ultimately positive. My cousin and his wife were warm, normal people who treated me like their own son. They got me into counseling to deal with the trauma of losing my parents, enrolled me in activities, and slowly helped me build confidence. The stutter came back briefly during the adjustment period, but it faded as I settled into their routine. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. High school was better. I made friends, played sports, even had my first girlfriend senior year. College came and went in a blur of classes, parties, and figuring out who I was as an adult. I studied business, got a decent job after graduation, and built what I thought was a normal life. I rarely talked about my time with my aunt, and when people asked about my childhood, I'd give vague answers about being raised by family after my parents died. My aunt and I kept minimal contact over the years. A card at Christmas, maybe a phone call on my birthday if she remembered. She never visited, never asked about coming to see me, and I never pressed the issue. Part of me was still that scared little boy who didn't want to rock the boat, and another part of me was honestly relieved to keep that distance. Our conversations were always stilted and awkward, full of long pauses and careful politeness. Update 1. I got the call on a Tuesday morning in March. I was sitting at my desk, going through emails and trying to wake up with my second cup of coffee, when my phone rang. The voice on the other end was professional, slightly nasal, identifying himself as my aunt's neighbor. He explained that she'd been found in her garden, apparently having suffered a heart attack while tending to her tomato plants. The paramedics said it was quick. The funeral was small, just me, a few neighbors, and someone from her church. I gave a brief eulogy about her taking me in when I had nowhere else to go, keeping it generic and respectful. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. People offered their condolences, sharing memories of my aunt as a quiet but reliable neighbor who kept to herself and maintained a beautiful garden. After the service, the lawyer handling her estate pulled me aside. My aunt had left everything to me, the house, her savings account, even her old car. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than I'd expected. The house, he explained, had been paid off years ago and was worth a decent amount despite needing some updates. He handed me the keys and said I could take as much time as I needed to decide what to do with everything. I drove to the house that evening, feeling strange about using my own key to enter a place that had been forbidden to me for so long. Everything looked exactly the same furniture, the same smell of lavender and old wood, the same heavy curtains that blocked out most of the natural light. Walking through those rooms brought back a flood of memories, not all of them pleasant. My old bedroom was now her sewing room, filled with fabric and patterns and a machine I'd never seen her use. The bathroom where I'd always felt watched had been updated with new fixtures, but that uneasy feeling crept back in as soon as I stepped inside. The kitchen looked frozen in time, right down to the same yellow curtains and chipped ceramic salt and pepper shakers on the windowsill. And there it was, the basement door, still painted that same dull green, still equipped with the heavy deadbolt that had kept me out for all those years. I stood in front of it for a long time, keyring in my hand, trying to work up the courage to finally see what had been hidden from me. Part of me wondered if I'd just find a normal basement, maybe some old furniture, holiday decorations, the usual stuff people store in basements. But something deeper, some instinct I'd carried with me since childhood, told me it wasn't going to be that simple. My hands were actually shaking as I sorted through the keys, trying each one until I found the one that fit. The deadbolt turned with a solid click that seemed to echo through the quiet house. The door opened to reveal wooden stairs leading down into darkness. I fumbled around for a light switch and found one at the top of the stairs. When the lights came on, I could see that the stairs were solid, not rotted like my aunt had claimed. No signs of rats either. Just a clean, finished basement that looked like it had been well maintained. As I made my way down the steps, the first thing I noticed was how organized everything was. Not like a storage basement at all, but more like an office or study. There were filing cabinets along one wall, a desk with multiple monitors, and what looked like some kind of electronic equipment humming quietly in the corner. The air smelled faintly of electronics and cleaning supplies. But it was the wall of monitors that really caught my attention. For large screens, all dark, mounted side by side above a long desk covered with notebooks, loose papers, and what looked like a small video camera. Below the monitors was a complex-looking device with multiple buttons and switches, connected to a tangle of wires that disappeared into the ceiling. My heart started pounding as the reality of what I was looking at began to sink in. This wasn't a storage basement or even a home office. This looked like some kind of surveillance setup, sophisticated and deliberately hidden. I approached the desk on unsteady legs, afraid of what I might find but unable to stop myself from looking. The notebooks were the same ones I remembered my aunt carrying around when I was a kid, filled with her cramped handwriting. I opened the first one at random and immediately felt sick. Page after page of observations about me, my eating habits, sleeping patterns, behavioral changes. Dates, times, detailed descriptions of my daily activities written with clinical precision. Subject appears agitated after phone call from school counselor. Pacing in room for approximately 15 minutes before settling at desk. Nightmare episode lasted 12 minutes. Called for mother 3 times before fully awakening. No response to comfort attempts. Stuttering more pronounced during mathematics homework. Frustration levels elevated. Possible correlation with difficulty level. I flipped through page after page of this stuff, my hands trembling as I read entry after entry documenting my childhood like I was some kind of lab rat. The dates went back to just a few weeks after I'd moved in with her, when I was still 5 years old and barely processing the loss of my parents. Update 2. I spent the next 2 hours going through those notebooks, and each one made me feel sicker than the last. My aunt hadn't just been watching me, she'd been documenting every aspect of my development with scientific precision. There were charts tracking my growth, graphs showing the frequency of my crying episodes, detailed analyses of my behavioral patterns. One notebook was dedicated entirely to what she called trauma responses. She'd cataloged every nightmare, every time I'd wet the bed, every instance where I'd withdrawn or acted out. She'd even recorded my conversations with myself, noting when I'd talk to imaginary friends or pretend my parents were still alive. Reading those entries felt like having my childhood dissected and laid bare. But the notebooks were just the beginning. When I finally worked up the courage to turn on those monitors, the true scope of what my aunt had been doing became clear. The screens flickered to life, showing a menu system that looked professionally designed. There were options for different rooms, different time periods, even different types of recordings. I clicked on bedroom first, and suddenly I was watching grainy footage of my old room. The camera angle showed everything: the bed, the desk, the window, even part of the door. A timestamp in the corner showed a date from when I was 7 years old. I fast-forwarded through hours of footage showing my younger self sleeping, playing with toys, doing homework, all recorded without my knowledge. The bathroom cameras were worse. Multiple angles showing every intimate moment of my childhood, every bath, every private moment when I thought I was alone. I felt violated in a way I'd never experienced before, like my entire childhood had been stolen from me and turned into some twisted form of entertainment. The living room footage showed me watching TV, reading, playing by myself on the floor. But what disturbed me most were the occasional shots of my aunt standing in doorways, watching me with that same clinical expression I remembered. Sometimes she'd be holding one of her notebooks, taking notes while I was completely unaware of being observed. There were hundreds of videotapes stored in filing cabinets, each one labeled with dates and brief descriptions. First week adjustment period. Behavioral regression, month 3. Social anxiety development, age 8 to 9. My entire childhood had been cataloged and stored like research data. In another filing cabinet, I found printed emails between my aunt and someone she referred to only as Dr. K. The emails discussed my progress, my reactions to different stimuli, and what they called environmental modifications to increase my stress levels and observe my coping mechanisms. They talked about me like I was a test subject in some long-term psychological experiment. One email thread particularly stuck with me. Dr. K had suggested introducing controlled trauma to see how I would adapt. My aunt responded with detailed plans about restricting my social interactions, creating uncertainty about my living situation, and deliberately triggering my abandonment fears. They discussed the best ways to document my responses without my knowledge. The most chilling part was reading my aunt's reports about my emotional state. She'd written extensively about my crying episodes, noting that they were becoming less frequent and theorizing that I was developing adaptive suppression mechanisms. She seemed pleased by this development, like my emotional numbness was a successful outcome rather than a tragedy. I found records showing that my aunt had been receiving payments from some kind of research institution. Monthly deposits into her bank account, always the same amount, dating back to shortly after I'd moved in with her. The payments had continued for the entire 7 years I lived with her, stopping only after I left to live with my cousin. There were also medical records, copies of my school health reports, notes from parent-teacher conferences, even records of childhood illnesses. Everything had been documented and filed away like I was part of some ongoing study. I realized that my aunt had probably volunteered me for whatever twisted research project this was, seeing an opportunity when my parents died and I had nowhere else to go. The surveillance equipment was more sophisticated than anything I'd expected to find in someone's basement. Professional-grade cameras, audio recording devices, motion sensors, the whole setup must have cost thousands of dollars. Someone had invested serious money in watching and documenting every moment of my childhood. As I continued reading through the files, I found references to other children, brief mentions of previous subjects, and comparative studies. The implications made my stomach turn. How many other kids had been put through this? How many other orphaned or vulnerable children had been turned into research subjects without their knowledge or consent? I called in sick to work the next day and spent it going through everything in that basement. I found detailed psychological profiles analyzing my personality development, academic performance, and social adjustment. My aunt and this Dr. K person had been tracking my progress like I was a long-term science experiment, measuring the effects of isolation, emotional manipulation, and controlled trauma on child development. The hardest part was reading my aunt's personal observations about my emotional state. She'd noted every time I'd seemed particularly sad or withdrawn, but instead of showing concern, she'd analyzed it as data points. When I'd stopped crying for my parents, she'd written about it like it was a breakthrough rather than recognizing it as a child giving up hope. Final update. After 3 days of going through everything in that basement, I knew I couldn't handle this alone. The scope of what my aunt had done was beyond anything I could have imagined, and the evidence of ongoing research involving other children meant this was bigger than just my personal trauma. I called the police first, though I wasn't sure how to explain what I'd found. The detective who came to the house was initially skeptical. My story sounded too bizarre, too much like something out of a movie. But when I showed him the basement setup and let him read through some of the notebooks, his attitude changed completely. Within hours, there were federal agents at the house. Apparently, what my aunt had been doing constituted a form of human trafficking and child exploitation, especially given the payments she'd been receiving and the evidence of coordination with outside parties. They seized everything, the computers, the tapes, the notebooks, all of it became evidence in what was now a criminal investigation. The FBI traced the payments back to a private research company that had been conducting unauthorized psychological studies on vulnerable children for decades. Dr. K turned out to be a disgraced psychologist who'd lost his license years earlier but had continued his research through private funding. My aunt was just one of several caregivers who'd been recruited to provide subjects for his studies. Learning that there were other victims was somehow both devastating and relieving. Devastating because it meant other kids had gone through what I'd experienced, but relieving because it confirmed that I wasn't crazy, that my childhood feelings of being watched and studied had been absolutely real. The investigation uncovered a network of people like my aunt, individuals who'd taken in vulnerable children specifically to use them as research subjects. Foster parents, relatives, even some adoptive families had been recruited and paid to document every aspect of these children's lives. The research company had been collecting data on trauma recovery, behavioral adaptation, and psychological development using children who had no idea they were being studied. My case became central to the investigation because my aunt had kept such detailed records. The 7 years of documentation provided prosecutors with clear evidence of the systematic exploitation and psychological abuse. The fact that she continued the surveillance even into my teenage years, documenting my recovery and adjustment, showed the long-term nature of the research project. The trial was a nightmare I wasn't prepared for. Having to testify about my childhood, knowing that strangers were hearing the most intimate details of my trauma, felt like being violated all over again. But seeing Dr. K and my aunt's conspirators held accountable made it worth the pain. Several of them received significant prison sentences for their roles in the research program. I learned that my aunt's death had actually been ruled suspicious after the investigation began. Apparently, she'd been showing signs of wanting to expose the research project in her final months, and there was evidence she'd been planning to contact authorities. Her sudden heart attack, while not definitively ruled a homicide, occurred just days before she was supposed to meet with a journalist about the program. The civil lawsuits came next. The research company, the individuals involved, even the institutions that had provided funding, everyone was held financially responsible for what they'd done to me and the other victims. The settlements were substantial, but no amount of money could undo the damage that had been done to my childhood and psychological development. Therapy became a necessity, not a choice. Working with a trauma specialist, I slowly began to understand how the surveillance and emotional manipulation had shaped my adult relationships and self-perception. The constant feeling of being watched that had followed me into adulthood finally made sense. My difficulty trusting people, my tendency to isolate myself, my problems with intimacy, all of it traced back to those 7 years of being unknowingly observed and studied. The house was eventually sold, with the proceeds going to a fund for other victims of the research program. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone else living there, knowing what had happened in those rooms. The basement was completely gutted before the sale, every piece of surveillance equipment removed and destroyed. I kept one thing from my aunt's possessions, a photo of my parents that I found in her bedroom dresser. It was the only picture of them I had, and despite everything she'd done, I was grateful she'd kept it safe. In her own twisted way, maybe she'd cared about me, even while she was exploiting me. Or maybe she'd just kept it as part of the research, another way to document my emotional responses. The other victims and I stay in touch through a support group that formed during the legal proceedings. There were 12 of us total, ranging in age from teenagers to adults in their 30s. Each of us had different experiences, but the common thread was the systematic violation of our childhoods for the sake of research that served no beneficial purpose. Some days I still catch myself looking over my shoulder or checking corners for cameras that aren't there. The paranoia that developed during those years may never completely go away, but understanding where it came from, knowing that my instincts were correct all along, has helped me reclaim some sense of control over my own life. I think about my parents sometimes, wondering what kind of person I would have become if they'd lived. Would I have been more trusting, more open, less guarded about my emotions? There's no way to know, but I try to honor their memory by living as authentically as I can despite the damage that was done. The basement door is gone now, replaced by a regular interior door when the house was renovated for sale. But I'll never forget the sound of that deadbolt clicking open, or the way my hands shook as I descended those stairs into the truth about my childhood. Sometimes the most horrifying discoveries are the ones that finally make everything else make sense. I survived something that no child should ever have to endure, and while the scars will always be there, I'm finally free from the surveillance that defined my early years. That little boy who was watched and studied and documented without his knowledge deserved so much better. But he survived, and that's something no amount of research data can take away.